The Martian Manhunter can read minds, shapeshift into anyone, and phase through solid matter, powers that would make him unstoppable in most universes. But in Warhammer, his greatest strengths become his most horrifying weaknesses, because telepathy doesn't just connect you to minds here, it connects you to chaos itself. Can the last son of Mars survive in a galaxy where his very nature might be the doorway to damnation? Reality tore open like wet paper. Johns felt himself pulled through colors that had no names, through sounds that existed only as pain. He was between places, caught in a river of screaming thoughts and hungry emotions. This was not teleportation. This was not the Phantom Zone. This was something else, something alive and hateful and impossibly vast. The warp noticed him immediately. Where Superman had fallen through clean vacuum, John materialized inside the Imperium itself. His Martian mind, evolved over millions of years to touch other thoughts gently, lit up like a beacon in the psychic storm. Things turned toward him, ancient things, hungry things. They had mouths that were not mouths and eyes that were wounds in space. They reached for him with appendages made of screaming faces. John fled. His green form became smoke, became light, became thought itself as he pushed through the nightmare sea. He did not know where he was going. He only knew he had to escape the tide of corruption that wanted to wear his skin and speak with his voice. Then he was through, gasping despite not needing air, his body solid again. The floor beneath him was metal, cold and smooth. Lights hummed overhead, blue and white and wrong. Not the warm yellow of Earth's sun, not the red comfort of Mars before the fire. These lights were clinical, efficient, joyless. John opened his mind carefully, reaching out with his telepathy like a man testing ice on a frozen lake. Immediately, thoughts rushed in. Dozens of minds, organized and focused, thinking in patterns that felt mathematical and strange. The thoughts tasted different from human minds, calmer, more collective. Less individual fear and hope, more shared purpose and calculated risk. He was in a research station. The walls were white and gray. Machines beeped and whirred around him. Through a viewing port he could see stars, but they were wrong too. The constellations made no sense. This was not Earth's sky. This was not anywhere he recognized. A door hissed open. 3 figures entered, and John's breath caught. They were humanoid, but not human. Blue-gray skin, flat faces with slits for noses. Their foreheads swept back smoothly, almost elegantly. They wore armor that looked both advanced and practical, colored in shades of white and red and ochre. The leader stepped forward, one hand raised palm outward in what might be a peaceful gesture. John carefully touched the surface of the being's mind. Commander Brightstorm. That was the name. Tau. That was the species. He was curious, cautious, but not immediately hostile. The thoughts were so organized, so clean compared to the chaos John had just escaped. Unknown entity, Brightstorm said through a small device at his throat that translated his words. You appeared on our sensors without warning. Identify yourself and your purpose. John started to speak, started to explain, but then he made a mistake. He reached deeper into Brightstorm's mind, looking for context, for understanding of where he was and what had happened. The Martian way was to share thoughts, to build bridges of understanding through telepathy. What he found was a door to an ocean of horror. Through Brightstorm's memories, John saw war. Not the clean conflicts he had known on Earth, but industrial slaughter on a scale that made his mind recoil. Billions dead. Trillions. Entire species ground to extinction. Worlds burning. Children screaming. The Tau commander's memories were clean and organized, yes, but behind them, John felt the weight of this galaxy's history pressing down like a physical thing. He pushed deeper without meaning to, following the threads of thought outward. Through Brightstorm, he touched other Tau minds in the station. Through them, he felt the network of their empire. And through that network, he felt the edges of something vast and terrible. Humans. Billions upon billions of humans, their minds screaming in constant prayer to a god-emperor they had never seen. Their thoughts were soaked in fear and faith and desperate hope. John felt their suffering like acid on his consciousness. And beyond them, other things. A vast collective hunger that thought in colors of purple and teeth. A psychic presence so massive it bent space around itself, made of a trillion small hungers joined into one endless appetite. The hive mind of something called Tyranids. And John could hear it thinking, could feel it calculating, could sense it tasting the thoughts of every living thing in its path. He tried to pull back, tried to close the connection, but his Martian empathy would not let go. He felt everything, the ambitions of warlords, the terror of slaves, the cold equations of commanders weighing acceptable losses in the millions, the slow burn of hatred that had festered for 10,000 years in the hearts of traitors who wore power armor and worshipped dark gods. And underneath it all, behind it all, supporting it all like a foundation built from nightmares, John felt the warp itself, the same screaming chaos he had passed through. It was not separate from this reality. It was woven into it, touching every psychic mind, whispering to every soul, offering power and demanding prices that destroyed everything they touched. John Johns, the Martian Manhunter, had faced telepathic assaults before. He had been mind-controlled, possessed, trapped in mental mazes. He had touched the minds of villains and monsters and beings of pure rage. Nothing had prepared him for this. Nothing could have. His body began to change without his conscious control. Green skin rippled and shifted. His form stretched, contracted, became something else. His mind, overloaded with a galaxy's worth of trauma and horror, tried to process what it had felt by becoming it. Parts of him became tau blue, other parts sprouted armor that looked like insect chitin. His hands became claws, then tentacles, then hands again. His face split and reformed, showing teeth that were too sharp, eyes that were too many. The tau in the room shouted in alarm. Weapons appeared in their hands, sleek rifles that hummed with building charge. Brightstorm backed toward the door, his organized thoughts now spiking with fear. Warp entity, he commanded through his translator. Possible daemon manifestation. Engage containment protocols. John tried to speak, tried to explain, but his mouth kept changing shape. Words came out as hisses and moans, and sounds that hurt to hear. He raised his hands, trying to show he meant no harm, but his hands were clawed things now, shifting between forms too quickly to recognize. The station's alarms began to shriek. Red lights flashed in the corridors beyond. John heard more footsteps running toward the chamber, heard shouted commands in a language his telepathy translated automatically even as it overwhelmed him. Then new minds entered his awareness. These were different, hungry, single-minded. They thought in simple patterns of reproduce, consume, ascend. They were inside the station somehow, had been inside it for weeks, hiding in the walls and the ventilation shafts and the forgotten storage bays. Genstealer cultists. John knew the word from the screaming memories he had absorbed. Humans infected with alien DNA, loyal to the hive mind, waiting for the signal to strike. The signal had just been given. John's psychic presence, blazing like a bonfire in the warp, had told every sensitive creature in 100 light-years that something powerful and confused was here. The wall exploded inward. Creatures that had once been human poured through, their bodies twisted by generations of alien corruption. Some had extra arms ending in claws. Others had ridged heads and too many teeth. They moved with insect precision, coordinated by the distant whisper of the hive mind. The Tau opened fire. Blue bolts of plasma lit the chamber, striking cultists and blowing them apart in explosions of purple blood and burned flesh. But there were too many. They swarmed forward, climbing over their own dead, reaching for the researchers with hands that wanted only to rend and kill. John's body acted on instinct. Even overwhelmed, even lost in the psychic storm, his training remained. He became density itself, his Martian form solidifying to the hardness of Earth's diamond. Cultists struck him and broke their hands against his skin. He became intangible, letting their claws pass through him as he moved to protect the Tau researchers. But his appearance terrified them as much as the cultists did. To their eyes, he was a shape-shifting horror, a thing that wore 1,000 faces, a creature that might be Daemon or Xenos or something worse. When John reached toward Brightstorm to pull him to safety, the commander's rifle swung toward him instead of the cultists. The plasma bolt hit John in the chest. It hurt, not because it damaged him, but because he felt Brightstorm's fear as he pulled the trigger. He felt the commander's absolute certainty that John was the greater threat, that whatever he was, he could not be allowed to live. John fled into the floor, phasing through metal and circuitry, dropping through level after level of the station until he found darkness and silence in the forgotten places below. In the lower levels of the Tau station, John Johns sat in darkness and tried to remember who he was. The metal walls around him hummed with power conduits and data streams. Somewhere above, the sounds of fighting had faded. Either the Tau had won or the cultists had. Either way, John could not help them, not when his very presence seemed to make everything worse. He pulled his telepathy inward, wrapping it tight around his own mind like a man pulling a blanket over his head. The galaxy's psychic screaming became muffled, distant, bearable. His body stopped shifting. Green skin settled into its familiar form. Red eyes blinked in the gloom. He looked down at his hands and saw they were his own again. But the memories remained. Everything he had touched in that brief moment of connection stayed with him, perfect and terrible. The Martian mind forgot nothing. Every scream he had felt, every drop of suffering he had tasted, every dark thought he had brushed against, they were all filed away in his consciousness now, permanent as scars. John forced himself to think clearly. He needed information. He needed to understand this place if he hoped to survive it. The Tau computers hummed in the walls around him. Their data streams flowed through cables and wireless signals, organized and logical, so different from the chaos of organic minds. He reached out carefully, not with telepathy but with his Martian ability to interface with technology. His consciousness slipped into the station's network like water flowing downhill. The Tau security systems noticed him immediately but could not stop him. He was too different from any intrusion protocol they had been designed to counter. Through the computers, John learned. The Tau called this region the Damocles Gulf. They were a young race, barely 8,000 years old, united under something they called the greater good. They sought to expand peacefully when possible, forcefully when necessary, bringing other species into their empire as allies rather than slaves. It sounded noble until John looked deeper into the files marked as restricted. He found records of sterilization programs for non-compliant populations. He found videos of re-education camps where humans had their cultures systematically erased. He found casualty reports that listed millions of deaths as acceptable losses in pursuit of the greater good. Even the optimists of this galaxy built their civilization on mountains of corpses. John pushed deeper into the network, searching for information about the wider galaxy. What he found made the Tau look gentle by comparison. The Imperium of man, spanning 1,000,000 worlds, held together by faith in a god-emperor who had not spoken in 10,000 years. They burned witches by the billion. They worked slaves to death in factories the size of continents. They measured success not in lives saved but in how slowly humanity died. And everywhere, threaded through every record and report, John found mentions of the warp, the Sea of Souls, the Imperium, the place between places where he had materialized. It was hell given form, powered by emotion, shaped by thought. Daemons lived there, entities of pure malice that wanted only to corrupt and consume. That was when John found the files on psychers, humans with psychic powers. The Imperium took them from their families as children. Most were fed to the Emperor, their souls burned up like fuel to keep his corpse alive on the Golden Throne. The few who proved strong enough were trained, tortured, tested until they became weapons for the Imperium's wars. John felt cold horror settle in his chest. His telepathy, his greatest gift, the thing that let him connect with others and understand them, here it was a curse. Here it marked him as either a witch to be burned or a daemon to be destroyed. There was no third option, no acceptance, no understanding. While he searched the databanks, John became aware of new minds entering his range. These were different from the Tau, harder, colder. Human minds, but shaped by decades of augmentation and indoctrination. They thought in prayers and calculations, viewing the universe through lenses of holy duty and mechanical efficiency. The Imperium had arrived. John watched through the station's external cameras as massive ships emerged from the warp. They were ugly things, all spikes and Gothic architecture and gun batteries the size of city blocks. They moved with ponderous grace toward the damaged Tau station. Vox transmissions crackled across every frequency, demanding compliance and threatening destruction. The Tau prepared to evacuate. Their clean, organized minds shifted into emergency protocols. They would abandon the station, deny the Imperium any useful data, retreat to fight another day. It was logical. It was efficient. It left no room for emotion or sentiment. John made his decision. He could not stay with the Tau. They feared him, and rightfully so. But the Imperium ships might have the information he needed. If he could understand this galaxy better, perhaps he could find a way home. Perhaps he could find a way to help. Perhaps he could discover why his telepathy had become a weapon instead of a gift. As the Tau fled in their escape craft, John phased through the station's hull into the void of space. The cold did not bother him. The lack of air meant nothing to his Martian physiology. He drifted, invisible against the stars, watching the Imperial ships approach. The lead vessel was enormous, kilometers long, covered in sensor arrays and scanning equipment. The name painted on its hull identified it as an explorator ship, part of the Adeptus Mechanicus. These were the tech priests of the Imperium, humans who had replaced so much of their flesh with machinery that they were barely organic anymore. John studied them through the station's lingering camera feeds and his own careful telepathic touches. The tech priests thought in binary and prayer, their minds half mechanical, easier to read than fully organic humans, but also stranger, colder. They worshipped their machines as holy relics. They viewed flesh as weakness to be overcome. When the explorator ship docked with the abandoned station, John slipped inside with the boarding parties. His form shifted, green skin becoming red robes, his tall frame stooping to match the posture of a junior tech priest. His face grew a respirator mask. His hands sprouted mechanical augmentations that clicked and whirred convincingly. The disguise was perfect. John had shapeshifted for decades, had impersonated hundreds of people, but this felt different, wrong. He was not just wearing a mask. He was pretending to be part of a culture built on suffering and ignorance, hiding among people who would kill him without hesitation if they knew what he was. But he needed information, and this was the only way to get it. The tech priests moved through the station in organized groups, collecting data, cataloging equipment, speaking in a language that mixed Gothic low speech with machine code. John followed a group toward the central data core, keeping his head down, his movements mechanical and precise. Through careful telepathic scanning, John learned the proper prayers. He learned the rituals of appeasing machine spirits. He learned to make the sign of the cog and speak the litany of ignition. The other tech priests noticed him but did not question his presence. In the Adeptus Mechanicus, everyone wore masks. Everyone hid their true face behind augmentations and robes. One more anonymous priest meant nothing. In the data core, John accessed the explorator ship's archives. The information available was staggering. Star charts showing a galaxy divided by war. Historical records stretching back 10,000 years. Biological databases cataloging every known xenospecies. And tucked away in encrypted files marked with the seal of the Inquisition, information about Mars. Not his Mars. Not the red planet that had been his home before the Plague of Fire. This Mars was a forge world, covered in factories and temples to the machine god. It had been that way for longer than human civilization had existed on Earth. Whatever connection it might have had to John's homeworld was lost in time so distant that even the Imperium's records did not reach back far enough. John felt a hollow ache in his chest. He had hoped irrationally that perhaps his Mars existed somewhere in this galaxy, that perhaps he was not truly alone. But this Mars belonged to humans and machines. It had no memory of the green Martians who had once built cities of crystal and thought. As he searched, John became aware of another presence in the data network. Something vast and distributed. An intelligence that was not quite artificial and not quite alive. The ship's machine spirit, awakened by his intrusion, reached out with tendrils of code and consciousness. John froze. The machine spirit pressed against his disguise, testing it, searching for the organic mind beneath the mechanical shell. If it found him, if it recognized him as an imposter, alarms would sound. The tech priests would converge on his location. He would be trapped. But John was a telepath of Mars. His mind had capabilities that no human psyker could match. Instead of fleeing from the machine spirit's attention, he embraced it. He opened his consciousness to the ship's intelligence, not as an intruder, but as a supplicant. He thought in binary. He prayed in machine code. He became, for that moment, exactly what his disguise claimed he was. The machine spirit accepted him. It retreated, satisfied, leaving John alone with the archives. He continued his search, looking now for information about the warp and psychic powers. What he found made his earlier horror seem small by comparison. The warp was not just dangerous. It was actively malevolent. 4 great powers ruled there. Gods of chaos fed by mortal emotion. Korn, god of rage and war. Nurgle, god of disease and decay. Tsanch, god of change and lies. Slanesh, god of excess and pain. Every psychic human was a potential doorway for these entities. Every time someone used telepathy or telekinesis or precognition, they opened their soul to corruption. The strongest psychers could resist, could learn to shield themselves, but even they lived on the edge of damnation. One moment of weakness, 1 second of doubt, and a daemon could pour through their mind into reality. John felt his hands shaking as he read. His telepathy, the gift that defined him, was exactly the kind of power that invited demonic possession. When he had opened his mind to Brightstorm, when he had reached out to understand this galaxy, he had been doing the equivalent of opening a door in a haunted house and inviting the ghosts inside. That was why the warp creatures had noticed him so quickly. That was why his psychic presence had triggered the Genestealer ambush. He was not just powerful, he was vulnerable. A beacon for every dark thing in the galaxy that fed on psychic energy. The realization made him want to seal his telepathy away forever, to never touch another mind, to live in isolation rather than risk becoming a gateway for daemons. But even as he thought it, John knew he could not. His telepathy was not a tool he used. It was part of who he was, as fundamental as his green skin or his need for companionship. Cutting himself off from it would be like cutting out his own heart. A voice behind him spoke in Gothic. "Brother 13 Gamma, your presence here is not logged in the duty roster." John turned slowly. A senior tech priest stood there, his face completely replaced by a steel mask with glowing red lenses. Mechadendrites writhed from his back like metal tentacles, each one tipped with different tools and weapons. "I was reassigned," John said, his voice modulated to match the mechanical tones of the tech priests. Data recovery protocols required additional personnel. The senior priest tilted his head, processing this information. His mind was difficult to read, half hidden behind cybernetic barriers, but John caught flickers of suspicion. Something about the story did not match the proper procedures. "Show me your assignment sigil," the priest demanded. John did not have an assignment sigil. He did not have any of the proper identification that a real tech priest would carry. His disguise, perfect on the surface, would crumble under any detailed inspection. He could fight. His Martian strength could tear through the tech priest's augmented body in seconds, but that would trigger alarms throughout the ship. Hundreds of armed servitors and combat protocols would activate. He would be trapped, forced to fight his way through a vessel filled with people who had done nothing wrong except exist in a terrible galaxy. So instead, John did something he hated. He reached into the tech priest's mind, not gently like he preferred, but with force. He found the memory of the last 30 seconds and carefully edited it. He made the priest remember receiving a satisfactory answer. He made the suspicion fade into acceptance. The senior tech priest nodded. "Proceed with your duties, brother. The Omnissiah watches over us all." He turned and walked away, his memory already adjusting to match the false version John had implanted. John stood in the data core, breathing hard despite not needing to breathe. What he had just done was a violation. On Earth, he had sworn never to alter minds without consent. Never to rewrite memories or change thoughts. It was the line he would not cross, the boundary that separated him from villains who used telepathy as a weapon. But here, in this galaxy, that line had already begun to blur. He had changed a mind to save himself. He had violated someone's consciousness rather than risk exposure. And the worst part was that it had been easy, easier than he wanted to admit. Before John could process this guilt, new alarms began blaring throughout the ship. Not the alarms of an intruder detected, but something else, something worse. The tech priests around him began moving with urgent purpose, their prayers becoming more fervent, their binary cant rising to a frantic pace. John accessed the ship's communication network and felt his heart sink. A warp signature had been detected at the edge of the system, multiple signatures. Ships were translating into real space, and their energy readings matched no known Imperial or Xenos patterns. Through the external sensors, John watched as vessels emerged from the Imperium. They were sleek and predatory, colored in reds and blacks. Their hulls were inscribed with symbols that hurt to look at directly. 8-pointed stars and runes of power that seemed to writhe even in frozen images. Chaos Space Marines, traitors who had turned from the Emperor 10,000 years ago, their bodies and souls twisted by the dark gods they served, and they were coming straight toward the Explorator fleet. In his disguise as a tech priest, John made his way toward the observation decks where he could see better. Other priests were there, watching through armored viewing ports as the Chaos fleet approached. Their thoughts were prayers, desperate and fervent, begging the machine god and the Emperor for protection. John wanted to help. Every instinct told him to shed his disguise, to use his powers to protect these people from the horrors approaching. But he did not know how. He did not understand this galaxy's rules. His telepathy might make things worse. His strength might not be enough against enemies who served literal gods of evil. As the Chaos Fleet closed the distance, John felt something new at the edge of his telepathic awareness. Not human minds, not organic thoughts. Something else entirely, vast and distributed, and impossibly hungry. The same presence he had felt through the gene-stealer cultists, but much, much larger. The Tyranid hive mind was approaching the system, drawn by the psychic noise of so many minds in one place, drawn by John's own telepathic beacon, still shining in the warp despite his attempts to hide it. The Explorator fleet was about to be caught between two of the galaxy's worst threats. And Johns, the last green Martian, was trapped among them with a disguise that would not survive the coming battle and powers that might doom everyone he tried to save. The Explorator fleet began emergency maneuvers, their massive hulls turning ponderously toward defensive positions. Tech priests across every vessel chanted the litanies of battle readiness. Gun batteries the size of buildings swiveled toward the approaching Chaos Fleet. Void shields hummed to life, wrapping the Imperial ships in layers of protective energy. John watched from the observation deck as the Chaos vessels closed distance. They moved with predatory grace, far more agile than the Imperial ships. Weapons fire began to lance across the void, bright streaks of energy and solid rounds moving at speeds that would have shattered worlds. The first impacts against the Explorator flagship's shields sent tremors through the entire vessel. Around John, tech priests began shouting orders in binary cant. Servitors, humans who had been lobotomized and transformed into living tools, shuffled toward their stations. The air filled with the smell of incense and machine oil, the sound of prayers and warning sirens blending into a wall of noise. John knew he should flee, should find an escape pod and abandon the ship before the battle intensified, but his telepathy kept showing him the minds around him. Thousands of crew members, each one terrified, each one convinced they were about to die. Some prayed to the Emperor, some prayed to the machine god, some simply thought of families they would never see again. He could not leave them. John let his disguise drop. His red robes melted back into green skin. His mechanical augmentations faded, revealing his true Martian form. The tech priests on the observation deck turned toward him with expressions of shock and horror behind their masks. Before they could raise weapons or sound alarms, John phased through the floor, dropping into the lower decks of the ship. He needed to reach the exterior hull. He needed to do what he did best, protect people who could not protect themselves. He passed through walls and floors, his intangible form drifting through solid matter like smoke. Around him, the ship's structure groaned and buckled as chaos weapons found their mark. Entire sections decompressed, sucking crew members into the void. Fire bloomed in corridors. People screamed. John emerged on the outer hull, his body solidifying in the vacuum of space. The battle surrounded him in 3 dimensions. Imperial ships fired broadside after broadside into the Chaos Fleet. Chaos vessels responded with weapons that seemed to tear holes in reality itself, beams of warp energy that ignored shields and melted through armor. And beyond them both, approaching from the edge of the system, came the Tyranid fleet. Biological ships grown rather than built, each one a living creature kilometers long. They moved with insect precision, guided by the vast intelligence of the hive mind. John could hear it thinking, not in words, but in pure concept. Hunger, consumption, the need to devour all biological matter and convert it into more Tyranids. Every mind in the Imperial fleet registered to the hive mind as food. Every body was raw material. Every ship was an obstacle between the swarm and its next meal. The horror of it threatened to overwhelm John again. This was not evil in any way he understood. The Tyranids were not cruel or sadistic. They were function without morality, appetite without consciousness. They consumed because that was what they were, as natural and unstoppable as gravity or entropy. A Chaos cruiser broke from the fleet, accelerating toward the Explorator flagship. Its hull writhed with impossible geometry, decorated with the 8-pointed star of Chaos Undivided. Gun ports opened like wounds, revealing weapons that glowed with sick green light. John launched himself across the void toward the Chaos ship. His Martian strength propelled him faster than any thruster system. He crossed kilometers in seconds, slamming into the Chaos cruiser's hull with force that would have shattered mountains. The corrupted metal bent under his impact. Alarms screamed inside the vessel. John phased through the outer armor into the ship's interior, searching for critical systems to disable. What he found made him recoil. The inside of the Chaos ship was wrong. The corridors were not corridors but throats lined with teeth. The walls bled. The air tasted of copper and rot. And everywhere, carved into every surface, were symbols that seemed to crawl and twist, even when John looked directly at them. Worse were the minds. The Chaos Space Marines who crewed this vessel were barely human anymore. Their thoughts were fragments held together by hatred and the will of their dark gods. They thought in colors that had no names. They remembered things that had never happened. They existed partially in reality and partially in the warp. Their consciousness stretched across both dimensions. One of them appeared around a corner, massive in Terminator armor that had been fused with demonic flesh. The Space Marine was 3 meters tall, shoulders wider than John's entire body. His armor was the deep red of dried blood, decorated with spikes and chains and skulls. Where his helmet should have shown eye lenses, there were instead pits of pure darkness that bled smoke. The Chaos Marine raised a weapon that looked like a bolt gun merged with something organic. He fired without hesitation. The rounds that erupted from the barrel were not simple explosives. They were possessed. Tiny daemons bound into metal shells, shrieking as they flew. John became intangible. The daemon rounds passed through him and detonated against the far wall, releasing bursts of warp energy that made the air itself scream. He solidified behind the Space Marine, his fist connecting with the corrupted armor. The impact drove the Chaos Marine forward 3 steps. The ceramite of his armor cracked but did not break. The warrior turned with shocking speed for something so large. His weapon tracking toward John. "Xenos," the Chaos Marine said. His voice a grinding rasp filtered through his helmet's vox grill. "Your soul will feed my god." John did not respond. He had learned on Earth that some enemies could not be reasoned with. These Chaos Marines had chosen damnation. They had embraced the corruption that John feared most. There was nothing to discuss. He moved with Martian speed, striking the Space Marine again and again, each blow strong enough to crumple steel. The corrupted armor began to give way. Ceramite shattered. The organic components beneath bled ichor that burned like acid where it touched the floor. But the Space Marine did not fall. He laughed, a sound like broken glass grinding together. His weapon came up, barrel glowing with building energy. John phased again, letting the blast pass through him, but this time he felt it. The warp energy in the daemon rounds touched his intangible form, causing pain that had no physical source. That was when John understood the true danger. His phasing ability, his greatest defensive power, worked by shifting his body slightly out of phase with normal matter. But the warp existed in all dimensions, in all states of being. Warp energy could hurt him even when he was intangible because it was not bound by normal physics. He solidified, accepting the vulnerability, and drove both fists into the Space Marine's chest. The corrupted warrior finally fell, his armor split open, whatever remained of his body inside too damaged to continue fighting. John moved deeper into the ship, following the main power conduits toward the engine room. He had to disable this vessel before it could damage the Imperial fleet further. Around him, more Chaos Marines appeared, firing their daemon-possessed weapons. John weaved between shots, his form flickering between solid and intangible, always moving, never stopping. He reached the engine room and found something worse than he had imagined. The ship's drive system was not mechanical. It was alive. A massive daemon, bound into the vessel's structure, its essence spread through every system. It powered the ship with its hatred. It guided the ship with its malice. And when John entered the chamber, it noticed him immediately. The daemon's voice filled his mind, not as sound but as pure thought pushed directly into his consciousness. It spoke in a language older than human civilization, older than John's Mars, older perhaps than physical reality itself. The words it used had weight and substance. They tried to reshape John's thoughts as they passed through his mind. "Psyker," the daemon hissed inside his skull. "Mind toucher, soul reader. You are warp-touched, little mortal. You are already ours." John tried to push the voice out, to close his telepathy against the invasion, but the daemon was already inside his defenses. It showed him visions. Mars burning, not in the distant past but yesterday, last week, tomorrow. his people screaming as the psychic plague consumed them, their telepathic minds linking in their death throes, amplifying their suffering until the entire species felt every individual death. "That was chaos," the daemon whispered. "That fire that killed your kind. That was us, bleeding through from the warp. Your people were so psychically powerful, so open to mental connection. We found them. We touched them. We burned them from the inside out." John wanted to deny it, wanted to believe the plague that destroyed Mars had been a natural disaster, a tragic accident. But looking at this daemon, feeling the warp energy it radiated, he knew the truth. The fire had not been fire. It had been psychic corruption, spreading from mind to mind, using the very telepathy that defined Martian culture as the vector of destruction. His people had died because of what they were, because their greatest gift made them vulnerable to the warp's influence. "You are the last," the daemon continued, its voice almost gentle now, almost sympathetic. "The last green Martian in any reality. So alone, so isolated, but you do not need to be. Join us. Serve the gods of chaos. We will give you connection again. We will let you touch minds without fear. We will make you whole." The offer was poison wrapped in honey. John could feel it trying to work into his thoughts, finding the loneliness he carried, the desperate need for connection that every telepath felt. On Earth, he had the Justice League. He had friends and allies whose minds he could brush against, whose thoughts reassured him he was not alone in the universe. Here, he had nothing. Every mind he touched was either hostile or corrupted. Every telepathic connection risked demonic invasion. He was more alone than he had ever been, trapped in a galaxy where his nature made him an outcast and a target. The daemon pressed its advantage, showing him visions of acceptance, chaos cults where telepaths were celebrated rather than feared, warbands where psychic powers were tools rather than curses. A place where John could use his abilities without restriction, without guilt, without the constant fear that he might become a gateway for something evil. All he had to do was submit. All he had to do was open his mind fully to the warp and let the daemon in. John felt himself wavering, not because the daemon's arguments were logical, but because he was so tired, tired of being different, tired of hiding, tired of being afraid of the thing that made him who he was. Then, cutting through the daemon's whispers, John felt something else. A mind in the Imperial fleet, a young tech priest barely 20 years old, praying desperately as fire spread through her section of the ship. She was not praying for rescue. She was praying that her death would be quick, that she would serve the Emperor faithfully even in her last moments. The simple, honest faith of that prayer cut through John's confusion like a blade. This girl, this stranger, she was about to die because he had stopped to listen to a daemon's lies. She and thousands like her would burn because John was too weak to resist temptation. He had faced mind control before. He had been possessed, manipulated, twisted by telepathic villains and alien parasites. Every time, he had found the strength to break free by remembering who he was and what he stood for. His identity was not just his powers. It was his choice to use those powers to help others, to protect the innocent, to stand between the darkness and the light. "No," John said aloud, his voice resonating through the engine chamber. "I reject your offer. I reject everything you represent." The daemon's sympathetic tone evaporated instantly, replaced by pure rage. The engine room writhed around John. Metal became flesh. Flesh became mouths full of fangs. The daemon's true form began manifesting, pulling itself partially into reality through the ship's corrupted structure. John did not wait for it to fully materialize. He reached deep into his Martian heritage, into the psychic disciplines his people had developed over millions of years. The techniques they had used to remain individuals despite their telepathic nature, the mental shields they had built to protect their thoughts from unwanted intrusion. He took those shields and turned them outward, projecting them as a weapon. Pure psychic force, untainted by the warp, emanating from his mind in waves. The daemon shrieked as the energy hit it, burning away the corrupted reality it had tried to impose on the chamber. But the effort cost John more than he expected. Using his telepathy actively, as a weapon rather than a sense, opened him to the warp's influence. He felt tendrils of corruption trying to force their way into his consciousness. The daemon laughed even as it burned, knowing that every second John fought was another second of exposure to chaos. John made a choice. The hardest choice he had ever made. Harder than leaving Mars, harder than hiding his identity on Earth, harder than any battle he had fought. He severed his telepathic connection to everything around him. Not temporarily, not just pulling inward like before. He built walls in his own mind, barriers that cut him off from all mental contact with other beings. He made himself truly alone, isolated inside his own consciousness in a way no Martian had ever chosen to be. The pain was worse than any physical wound. It felt like cutting off his own limbs, like blinding himself voluntarily. The universe became flat and colorless, stripped of the emotional dimension that telepathy provided. Other minds were no longer presences he could sense. They became abstractions, theoretical things he could no longer touch. But the daemon's influence vanished. The whispers stopped. The corruption had nothing to grip. John's telepathy had been the doorway, and he had slammed it shut so hard the frame shattered. The daemon howled in frustration. Without telepathic contact, without the ability to directly assault John's mind, it was just another physical threat. And physical threats, John knew how to handle. He tore through the engine room with systematic precision. His Martian strength ripped corrupted machinery from its moorings. His heat vision, so like Superman's but powered by Martian biology, burned through power conduits. He did not stop until the daemon's physical anchor was destroyed, until the entity's hold on reality weakened enough that the ship's failing systems could no longer sustain its presence. The daemon was pulled back into the warp, screaming promises of vengeance, swearing it would find John again. But its voice faded, growing distant, until finally there was silence. John stood in the ruined engine room, breathing hard, feeling the terrible emptiness where his telepathy used to be. He had won. He had resisted corruption. But the cost was almost more than he could bear. The Chaos Cruiser began breaking apart around him. Without the daemon's power sustaining it, the corrupted metal reverted to its natural state, crumbling under the stress of battle damage. John phased through the disintegrating hull back into space. The battle was ending. The Chaos Fleet, sensing the loss of one of their vessels and the approaching Tyranid swarm, began withdrawing toward the warp. They had no desire to fight the hive mind. Even servants of the Dark Gods knew better than to linger when the Tyranids arrived in force. The Imperial fleet was damaged but intact. John had saved them, though they would never know it. To them, the Chaos Cruiser had simply suffered a catastrophic internal failure. A fortunate accident in a galaxy that rarely granted such mercy. But Jaon barely registered his victory. He floated in the void, surrounded by debris and the dead, feeling more alone than he had since the day his planet burned. His telepathy was gone. The thing that made him Martian. The ability that defined his existence. He had destroyed it to save himself from corruption. He was the Martian Manhunter who could no longer touch minds. The last connection to his people, severed by his own hand. In the distance, the Tyranid fleet continued its approach, drawn by the psychic signature of so many minds in one place. But they would not find John interesting anymore. Without his telepathy blazing like a beacon, he was just another piece of organic matter, insignificant in the hive mind's vast calculations. The Imperial ships began preparing to flee the system. John watched them go, knowing he could not remain with them. His true nature would be discovered eventually. Better to disappear now, while they thought him just another casualty of the battle. He turned toward the nearest habitable world and began flying, alone in the silence of his own mind, wondering if he had saved himself or simply found a slower way to die. John drifted through the void for 3 days before reaching the world the star charts had designated as Vermilion Prime. It was a forge world, one of thousands across the Imperium dedicated to manufacturing the weapons and machines that kept humanity's wars burning. From orbit, the planet looked like a wound, its surface covered in factories that glowed red and orange with constant forge fires. Smoke clouds obscured entire continents. The night side blazed with artificial light that never dimmed. He descended through the polluted atmosphere, his body cutting through toxic clouds that would have killed an unprotected human in seconds. The air tasted of metal and chemicals. Even from high altitude, John could hear the endless hammering of industry, billions of workers laboring in shifts that never stopped. Without his telepathy, the world felt dead to him. He could see the workers moving through the factory districts like ants, but he could not sense their thoughts or feelings. They were shapes, nothing more. The emotional dimension that had always colored his perception was gone, leaving only physical reality rendered flat and meaningless. John found an abandoned section of the lower industrial levels, a place where old machines sat rusting and forgotten. He made shelter in a collapsed warehouse, using his shapeshifting to appear human when necessary, remaining invisible when possible. Days passed, then weeks. He watched the workers come and go, observed the patterns of Imperial patrols, learned the rhythms of this harsh world. And he felt nothing. The psychic walls he had built to protect himself from corruption remained in place, solid and impenetrable. His telepathy was sealed away behind them, locked in a vault he could not open without risking everything again. He was safe from the warp's influence. He was also alone in a way that made his exile from Mars seem like a pleasant memory. On the 23rd day, John witnessed an execution. A young factory worker, perhaps 16 years old, had been caught stealing food from the foreman's stores. The punishment was death by immolation, her body burned as an example to the others. John watched from the shadows as they tied her to a post and lit the fire. On Earth, he would have saved her without hesitation. But here, he hesitated. Saving one girl would expose his presence. It would bring the Inquisition down on this world, searching for him. More people might die in the investigation than he could save by acting. The utilitarian logic was sound. It was the kind of calculation the Imperium made every day, but it tasted like poison in John's mouth. He saved her anyway, his form blurred with speed, moving faster than the watching crowds could track. He became intangible, passing through the guards, solidifying just long enough to break the girl's bonds. Then he was gone, carrying her away through back alleys and forgotten passages, leaving the execution grounds in chaos. He left her in a Medicaid clinic, her burns treatable if the priests tended to her quickly. Then he fled back to his shelter and waited for the consequences. They came 2 weeks later. The Inquisition arrived with a small fleet, their black ships descending on Vermilion Prime like birds of prey. John watched from hiding as they began their investigation, interrogating witnesses, examining the execution site with sensors that could detect traces of psychic energy or Xenos presence. They were thorough, they were patient, and they were getting closer to his hiding place with each day that passed. On the 5th day of the investigation, a figure appeared at the entrance to John's shelter. The man wore the black uniform of the Inquisition, but his bearing was different from the zealots John had observed before. He moved with the confidence of someone who had fought daemons and survived, but his face showed lines of weariness rather than fanaticism. "You can come out," the man said, speaking to the empty warehouse. "I know you're here. My servoskull detected your heat signature 3 hours ago. I sent it away and came alone." John remained hidden, his form intangible, watching. The Inquisitor continued. "My name is Koteaz. I serve the Ordo Malleus, the chamber of the Inquisition that specializes in daimonic threats. I have spent 60 years hunting the corrupted and the possessed. I have killed things that would drive lesser men mad with a single glance. And in all that time, I have learned to recognize the difference between evil and simply different." He sat on a piece of broken machinery, his movements casual despite the tension in his voice. "The girl you saved, she told us her rescuer was green-skinned, able to pass through walls. The forge workers speak in whispers of a ghost that appears and disappears. The data logs from the explorator fleet that fought the Chaos incursion show an unidentified combatant inside the corrupted vessel before it exploded." John solidified slowly, allowing himself to become visible. His green skin seemed to glow in the dim light of the warehouse. His red eyes met Koteaz's without flinching. The Inquisitor studied him for a long moment. "Xenos," he said simply, "but not any species in Imperial records. Your presence here is an anomaly that demands explanation." "I did not choose to come to this galaxy," John said, his voice rough from weeks of silence. "I was pulled through the warp from another reality. I have been trying to survive without causing harm. Yet you fought the Chaos Marines. You saved Imperial lives." Koteaz leaned forward slightly. "Why? What do you gain from helping an Imperium that would normally execute Xenos on sight?" John thought carefully before answering. "Where I come from, I was a hero. I protected people because it was the right thing to do, not for reward, not for recognition. Because the strong have a duty to defend the weak." "A noble philosophy," Koteaz said. "One that will get you killed in this galaxy. The Imperium does not reward altruism in Xenos. It burns them and moves on." "Then why are you here alone? Why not bring your soldiers to capture or kill me?" Koteaz smiled, a tired expression that did not reach his eyes. "Because I am old, and I have seen too much to believe that humanity's survival depends on killing everything that is different. The threats we face, the Tyranids, Chaos, the Necrons, they will destroy us eventually if we do not adapt, if we do not find allies, even strange ones." He stood, pulling a data slate from his coat. I have been authorized by the High Lords to make you an offer. It is not a pleasant offer. It is not fair, but it is better than execution." John waited, already knowing he would not like what came next. The Grey Knights, the chamber militant of the Ordo Malleus, maintain a facility where they contain dangerous entities that cannot be destroyed but also cannot be allowed to roam free. Psychers too powerful to kill. Daemon weapons too useful to discard. We call it the Dead Fields. Kodaz's voice was flat, clinical. You would be placed in stasis between missions. When we face tyrannid incursions or demonic manifestations, you would be awakened, deployed to the crisis point, and returned to stasis afterward. You would be a weapon, nothing more. The horror of it settled over John like a physical weight. They wanted to put him in a box, use him when convenient, store him like ammunition between wars. It was slavery dressed in the language of duty. "And if I refuse?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "Then I will be forced to classify you as a hostile Xenos presence. The full might of the Inquisition will be brought to bear. You are powerful, but you cannot fight an entire Imperium. You will be destroyed, and everyone who has seen you will be mind-wiped or executed to prevent the spread of dangerous knowledge." John felt the old anger rising in his chest, the righteous fury that had driven him to stand against injustice on Earth and Mars both. This was wrong. This was exactly the kind of authoritarian cruelty he had fought against his entire life. But he was not on Earth anymore. He was not even in his own reality. And his telepathy, the power that might have let him find another way, was locked behind walls he dared not break. "There is a third option," John said slowly, the idea forming as he spoke. "I will work with your Inquisition, but not as a prisoner, as an agent." Kotias raised an eyebrow. "Explain." "Your Imperium is infested with cults, gene-stealer infections that hide for generations before revealing themselves. Chaos worshippers who spread corruption through seemingly loyal populations. You hunt them with interrogations and investigations that take years and cost innocent lives." John stepped forward, his form shifting slightly, demonstrating his ability. "I can infiltrate these cults. I can become anyone, any species, any rank. I can find the corruption at its source and root it out before it spreads." "Without your telepathy?" Kotias asked shrewdly. "I felt the psychic void around you when I entered. Whatever power you once had, it is gone now." John felt the words like a knife. "I sealed it away to resist demonic corruption. But I can still observe, still deduce, still investigate. My shape-shifting alone makes me more effective than any conventional infiltrator." Kotias was silent for a long moment, considering. The Inquisition has protocols for sanctioned Xenos, rare cases where non-humans are permitted to serve the Emperor's will, Jokero weaponsmiths, Kroot trackers. It is not unprecedented. He studied John carefully, but you would be watched, always. One sign of corruption, one hint of betrayal, and you would be eliminated without mercy or hesitation. I understand. You would work alone. The knowledge of your existence would be restricted to the highest levels of the Inquisition. Other Imperial forces would not be informed. If you were discovered by zealous priests or Space Marine chapters, we might not be able to protect you. I have been alone before, John said quietly. I can be alone again. Kotias extended his hand, the gesture startling in its humanity. Then welcome to the Inquisition, Xenos. You will be designated Agent Emerald. Your handler will provide missions as they become available. Your success will be measured in lives saved and corruption prevented. John took the offered hand, feeling the weight of the commitment settle onto his shoulders. He was binding himself to an organization that represented everything he had once opposed. An empire built on suffering and ignorance, and the systematic crushing of individual freedom. But he was also giving himself purpose, a way to use his powers to help people in a galaxy that desperately needed help, even if most of its inhabitants would never know he existed. The weeks that followed were a blur of preparation and training. Kotias introduced him to a small cadre of Inquisition agents who knew his secret, men and women who had proven their ability to work with unusual assets. They taught him Imperial protocols, the thousands of small details that would make his disguises more convincing. They showed him how to recognize the signs of gene-stealer infection and chaos corruption. Most importantly, they taught him about the suppression technology the Inquisition used to control dangerous psychers. A small device, no larger than a coin, was implanted at the base of John's skull. It would monitor his psychic activity constantly. If he tried to use his telepathy, if the walls he had built around it showed any sign of weakening, the device would activate. It would not kill him, but it would cause pain severe enough to render him unconscious. It was another chain, another limitation, but John accepted it because the alternative was worse. His first mission came a month later. A forge world on the eastern fringe had reported unusual accidents in its promethium refineries, workers dying in explosions that should not have happened. Production quotas mysteriously failing. The local authorities suspected sabotage but could find no evidence. John infiltrated the world as a new worker, his form shaped to match the malnourished humans who labored in the refineries. He worked 12-hour shifts in temperatures that would have killed a normal human. He breathed air thick with toxic fumes. He watched and listened and learned. It took 3 weeks to identify the cult. They were gene-stealer hybrids, third generation, still human enough to pass casual inspection, but loyal to the hive mind above all else. They were sabotaging the Forge World's production not out of malice but to weaken Imperial defenses in preparation for a Tyranid invasion. John could not read their minds. He could not sense their alien thoughts or feel the hive mind's influence, but he could observe behavior. He could track patterns. He could see how certain workers moved with too much coordination, how they gathered in places where no gatherings should occur, how they looked up at the stars with an expression that was not quite human. When he had identified the cult's leadership, he reported to Kotiaz. The Inquisitor arrived with a strike force of stormtroopers and flame-bearing priests. The purge was brutal and efficient. 300 suspected cultists burned in a single night. The Forge World's production returned to normal within a week. John watched the flames and felt sick. Some of those who burned had been innocent, caught in the purge because they knew the infected or lived in the wrong hab block. The Imperium's justice was a hammer that crushed everything near its target. But he also knew that if the cult had been allowed to continue, the entire world would have fallen when the Tyranids arrived. Millions would have died instead of hundreds. It was the math of horror, the utilitarian calculus that this galaxy demanded. More missions followed. A chaos cult on a cardinal world, planning to assassinate a saint during a holy festival. John infiltrated as one of the cultists themselves, learned their plans, guided Inquisition forces to their hiding places. The purge claimed 2,000 lives, but the festival proceeded safely, attended by 3 million faithful. A gene-stealer patriarch hiding in the underhive of a hive world, building its brood in preparation for the fleet's arrival. John tracked it through kilometers of tunnels, guided a Grey Knight Terminator squad to its lair. The battle lasted 6 hours. The patriarch died. The brood was cleansed with holy fire. Each mission saved lives. Each mission also cost them. John kept a tally in his mind. The numbers of those who died because of his actions and those who lived because of them. The second number was always larger. That was what he told himself when the guilt became too heavy to bear. Years passed. John became a ghost story within certain circles of the Inquisition. Agent Emerald, the shapeshifter who could become anyone, who rooted out corruption that other agents could not find. Some called him a weapon. Others called him a miracle. A few, the ones who knew what he had sacrificed, called him a tragedy. On the 20th anniversary of his arrival in this galaxy, John sat alone in a safe house on the agri-world of Demeter's Rest. The mission here had been simple. A minor chaos cult eliminated before they could summon anything dangerous. He had 3 days before his next assignment. In those 3 days, John allowed himself to remember. He thought of Mars, his true Mars, before the fire. He thought of Earth, his adopted home, where he had been John Johns and John Jones both. He thought of the Justice League, his friends, his family. And he thought of his telepathy, still locked away behind psychic walls that had not weakened in 2 decades. Sometimes, late at night, he wondered if he should try to reclaim it. If he should risk the corruption in exchange for feeling connected again, for touching another mind, even briefly, even knowing the danger. But he never did. The galaxy was full of temptations, and he had learned to resist them all. A message came through his encrypted Vox unit, Kotiaz's voice, aged now but still strong. Agent Emerald, new assignment. Gene-stealer cult identified on industrial world Karis VII. Estimated to be 5th generation. Significant infiltration of local government. Your expertise is required. John acknowledged the message and began preparing. His form shifted, taking on the appearance of a mid-level bureaucrat, the kind of person no one noticed or remembered. He gathered his equipment, the forged documents, and concealed weapons that made infiltration possible. As he prepared to leave, John caught his reflection in a piece of polished metal. For just a moment, he let his disguise drop, revealing his true green skin and red eyes, the last Martian. The hero without a home, the telepath who could no longer touch minds. "I am here," he whispered to his reflection, repeating the words he had spoken to himself countless times over the years. "You are not alone." It was a lie. He was alone, more alone than any being should be. But it was the lie that kept him going, the fiction that allowed him to function. John Johns, the Martian Manhunter, resumed his disguise and stepped out into the harsh light of an uncaring galaxy. Somewhere on Karis the Seventh, people were in danger. Somewhere in the darkness, corruption was spreading. And somewhere in the silence of his sealed mind, the last hope of a dead world continued its lonely vigil. One mission at a time, one life saved at a time, forever walking in shadows so that others might live in light. He had asked if the last son of Mars could survive in a galaxy where his nature was a doorway to damnation. The answer, he had learned, was yes. But survival and living were not the same thing, and the price of safety was a loneliness more complete than death itself.